Hello, citizens of the world! I know we are super focused on being a citizen of the USA in this class, but truly we are all human, and the USA does not exist alone. Think about it. When you go to the store and see where things are made, only a fraction of what we consume actually comes from the US. Not only that, consider how something like drought, famine, or war can be happening somewhere else, yet still affect us here at home. So it is important to remember that we are not alone in this. All of these factors and many more are why we engage in what is called foreign policy. At the end of the lesson today, you should be able to define foreign policy, explain how it is created, and describe its impact on American life. Let's dive in. In the last lesson, we discussed domestic policy. And remember, domestic policy is a process in which both the checks and balances as well as the separated powers of our government become very clear. But what about our relationship with the rest of the world? In Unit 1, we discussed the global system of nation-states and the idea of sovereignty, which means each nation must create domestic and foreign policy. The way in which we interact with other nations is called foreign policy. The essential question for today is this: how does foreign policy impact domestic policy and thus American life? Who would you think is responsible for foreign policy? Federal, state, or local government? If you guessed federal, you would be right. And foreign policy has typically been nonpartisan because political differences have been about strategy rather than goals. Foreign policy differs from domestic policy in that the executive branch is considered the clear constitutional leader in its design and execution. However, you think the framers would have left Congress out of this one? No way! Check out the PDF to find out the role of the other branches. Now, foreign policy is a long-term game. It has a predefined purpose and consists of a much longer series of initiatives. For example, the initiatives during the War on Terrorism were designed with the purpose of stopping states from supporting non-state terrorist groups. This policy determined particular actions that may be used, such as supporting particular nations with weapons or foreign aid, issuing sanctions, embargoes, and even engaging in open conflict. Double word alert! A sanction is a diplomatic tool used to deter or punish another nation for certain actions. It is often applied economically. An embargo is a total break in trade relations with another nation. Foreign policy typically is forged and defined across several different administrations through congressional actions and by passing initiatives over the course of decades rather than through any single actions. So, how to even begin with all those moving pieces of the world's economies, cultures, and governments? Well, foreign policy, like domestic policy, reflects the values of a nation. America values free markets, the rule of law, a limited government, civil rights, and democratic practices. These values and global conditions create policy goals. Some of these goals include the protection of the U.S. and its citizens, the maintenance of access to key resources and markets, the preservation of a balance of power in the world, and the protection of human rights and democracy. Let's take a step back for a little word alert! Foreign policy is the long-term strategy as well as short-term tactics a nation pursues in dealing with other nations in which the aim is to meet specific goals that typically reflect a nation's values. And with that, it's time for a Show What You Know. What branch of government leads foreign policy development? What values influence our foreign policy? Define foreign policy. The amount of foreign policy creation where that creation happens and what it applies to is as broad as the world is diverse. Policies cover multiple topics, go through multiple agencies and branches, and require long-term spending and planning. All of this results in the implementation of long-term strategies, like the War on Terror. So, what are some of the components of these strategies? Well, creating public laws is a basic way to enact changes here at home in order to effect change abroad. And here we have Congress with important responsibilities again. Congress passes laws that govern the tools and means available to the executive branch in directing foreign policy. The Patriot Act, for instance, was a law that passed which developed tools to gather intelligence. Treaties and other agreements made with other countries also have the potential to influence domestic policy. The Russian-Ukrainian War, for example, has sparked the Biden administration's use of the Defense Production Act to move America into cleaner energy by streamlining the mining of precious metals used in the production of clean energy technology. Another more direct area of foreign policy which makes significant changes to the global landscape is known as sharply focused outputs. In other words, more specific tactical decisions used to direct foreign policy. These typically involve only the executive branch, though there are always exceptions to this. One such area of involvement is direct military engagement. Now, these kinds of outputs are one of the exceptions where Congress's war powers can be involved. Another area is the enactment of emergency funding measures, which deal with international crises. And yet again, this requires Congress to appropriate money. All of these areas can be enacted and executed at a rapid speed, given the turtle's pace at which many other government operations move. This would be a great time to check out the PDF to examine Alexander Hamilton's concept of energy and dispatch, as well as to explore different approaches to foreign policy. Time again to show what you know. How does each branch of government influence the policy creation process? Let's step back and review that essential question. How does foreign policy impact domestic policy and thus American life? To answer this, we need another word alert! Globalization is the process of interaction and integration among people, companies, and governments worldwide. Globalization has accelerated since the 18th century due to advances in transportation and communication technology. Due to globalization, decisions made in one nation have massive impacts on the economies and societies of most other nations. Take the Russia-Ukraine war. Because of Russia's major influence in the oil markets, rising gas prices trigger release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve here in America. These were reserves meant for utter catastrophes or emergencies, and may be sorely missed if something significant requires our use of domestic oil in the future. And although domestic policy appears on its surface to only affect us here at home, we can see that foreign policy can trigger domestic policy responses. Take this, for example. After the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, an international agreement that set curbs on different energy sectors in an effort to combat climate change, the 2021 presidential budget proposal had a 26.5% cut to the Environmental Protection Agency. While there may not be a concrete connection between the two, we can still see the influence that global arrangements have on domestic policies. What resulted from defunding the EPA was less ability for the government agency to inspect plants, mines, and other industrial sites which may impact the climate and our health. Big picture, our values and our goals interact to determine the ways domestic and foreign policy interact. They establish the purpose and provide the justification for a particular tactic, and these typically align with a larger strategy. For example, we value democracy and human rights, and therefore we have the stated goal of protecting human rights and democracy across the globe. The pursuit of these values can be seen during the Cold War and War on Terror, wars in which we wanted to prevent the spread of particular ideologies we viewed as harmful to the world. In pursuit of these ideals, we have been led to provide foreign aid to areas around the world, such as to Africa, and to support humanitarian causes, such as fighting hunger, AIDS, and genocide. The war on terror abroad meant less privacy and other restrictions to our way of life at home. But hey, no one's perfect, right? Sometimes our values and our goals actually don't agree. Sometimes our larger foreign policy strategies, such as the Cold War, are used to justify our actions. Take Operation PB Success in 1954, for example. Operation PB Success was a CIA covert operation that led a coup d'etat that removed the democratically elected leaders in Guatemala. Wait a second, getting rid of democracy? That doesn't sound like one of our values. Not only that, Guatemala already had instituted universal suffrage, land reforms, and had banned exploitative labor practices. Oh, but these reforms didn't work to benefit U.S. corporate interests. Isn't that a shame? These democratic reforms had a negative impact on the business of a U.S. corporation, namely the United Fruit Company. So, through the use of lobbyist efforts, the corporation successfully convinced the U.S. federal government to lead the coup. What followed the coup was 40 years of U.S.-backed dictatorships, some of which committed genocide on the indigenous Mayan people. The effect in the U.S. was lower food prices. Looks like our goals and our values really don't line up sometimes, huh? As you can see, in response to global events, our values interact broadly to determine the purpose, strategy, and initiatives, which in turn dictates which kind America shows up in foreign policy. Time for our last Show What You Know. How does foreign policy impact domestic policy and thus American life? Recap! Today we learned that foreign policy is the long-term strategy as well as short-term tactics a nation pursues in dealing with other nations in which the aim is to meet specific goals that typically reflect a nation's values. We also learned that foreign policy inherently impacts domestic policy within a highly interdependent world. In the next lesson, we will look at the different groups that influence public policy. But that's it again for us today. Thanks for hanging with us, and remember to vote, debate, and participate. Hey, hey!